When my husband David and I first became parents, we believed raising children would be challenging yet rewarding, a fulfilling chapter in our lives. Our firstborn, Ryan, was everything we hoped for: bright, well-behaved, and a joy to be around. He thrived academically and socially, making parenting feel almost effortless. But when our second son, Matthew, was diagnosed with epilepsy at age 5, everything changed. At first, we tried to manage his condition with patience and diligence. The seizures were terrifying, but we followed the doctor's advice and adjusted our lives to ensure he was safe and cared for. We tried to create a stable environment for both of our boys, but the strain of balancing Matthew's needs with Ryan's upbringing began to show. David and I felt like we were constantly walking a tightrope. As if epilepsy wasn't enough, Matthew was later diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia when he was 8. The news hit us like a freight train. It wasn't just about managing his seizures anymore. Now we had to navigate a world of learning disabilities and hyperactivity. We didn't know where to start or how to handle it. Parenting books and online forums didn't prepare us for the reality of having a child with such complex needs. Matthew's behavior became harder to manage as the years went on. He struggled in school, and his teachers often called us in to discuss his disruptive actions and poor grades. Despite our efforts to support him, nothing seemed to work. The frustration began to build, and we started comparing him to Ryan more often than we should have. Ryan was excelling in every area, and it felt natural, albeit unfair, to wish that Matthew could just follow his brother's example. Over time, this created an unspoken dynamic in our household. Ryan was the child who made us proud, while Matthew was the one who drained us emotionally and mentally. Deep down, I knew this wasn't right, but in the chaos of everyday life, we didn't know how to stop the cycle. The emotional toll of parenting a special needs child began to consume us. David and I started snapping at each other over small things, our patience wearing thin. We couldn't agree on how to handle Matthew's issues, and our own stress only fueled the growing rift between us and our son. I felt guilty all the time. Guilty for not being able to help Matthew, guilty for neglecting Ryan's emotional needs, and guilty for failing to keep our family together. Matthew, of course, sensed this tension. He wasn't oblivious to how we treated him differently from Ryan. The resentment in his eyes grew more pronounced with each passing year. He became more withdrawn at first, but as he approached his teenage years, the defiance started. He began pushing every boundary we set, testing our limits in ways that left us exasperated and confused. When Matthew was 13, things took a darker turn. He started skipping classes, talking back to teachers, and refusing to do his homework. It was as if he wanted to confirm every negative assumption we'd ever made about him. At the time, I didn't see it for what it was, a desperate cry for attention and validation. Instead, I saw it as yet another challenge in an already overwhelming situation. Looking back, I realize now that David and I were in survival mode. We weren't equipped to handle Matthew's needs, but instead of admitting that and seeking help, we doubled down on control. We thought that by being stricter, by demanding obedience, we could mold him into the child we needed him to be, but all it did was push him further away. Even so, there were moments when I saw glimpses of the little boy who used to cling to my leg, asking for bedtime stories and hugs. Those moments reminded me that Matthew wasn't just his diagnosis or his behavior. He was still my son, a child who needed love and understanding, even when it felt impossible to give. But those moments became fewer and farther between, overshadowed by the mounting stress and frustration. David and I felt like we were drowning, and there was no lifeline in sight. We didn't know how to parent Matthew anymore. We didn't know how to help him or ourselves. It was a time filled with doubt, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of failure. As much as I hate to admit it now, part of me started to resent Matthew for how hard he made our lives. I resented the fact that our family dynamic revolved around his needs, while Ryan's accomplishments often went unnoticed. And most of all, I resented myself for feeling that way. Parenting Matthew became a constant battle, and it felt like we were losing. I began to wonder if we were doing more harm than good by keeping him in an environment where he clearly felt unloved and misunderstood. We needed a solution, a way to give him a chance at a better life, even if it meant stepping back as his primary caregivers. That realization was the first step toward the decision that would ultimately change all of our lives. At the time, I thought we were doing what was best for Matthew and for our family. But looking back, I wonder if it was the beginning of an even deeper fracture. By the time I was 13, I had stopped caring about school entirely. My grades had plummeted to the point of no return, but I didn't care. Nothing I did seemed to matter to my parents, so why should I bother? I was angry, lost, and desperate for their attention, even if it was negative. Instead of studying or trying to meet their impossible expectations, I spent my time acting out. I wasn't just failing my classes, I was skipping them, breaking rules, and pushing every boundary I could find. I still remember the day I was called into the principal's office for the third time that month. My teacher had caught me writing profanity on my desk, and it wasn't the first time I'd been caught vandalizing school property. The principal had already warned me that one more incident would result in expulsion, but I didn't take him seriously. My parents had always managed to bail me out before, blaming my behavior on my issues and convincing the school to give me yet another chance. I thought this time would be no different, but this time was different. A week later during math class, I bought a pack of cigarettes to school and decided to light one up right in the middle of class. I don't even know what I was trying to prove. Maybe that I didn't care about the consequences, or maybe I just wanted to see how far I could push my luck. My teacher immediately demanded that I leave the classroom, but instead of complying, I flipped him off in front of the entire class. That was the moment everything spiraled out of control. Within hours, my parents were called to the school. I can still picture the look of fury on their faces as we sat in the principal's office. This time, they didn't try to defend me or make excuses for my behavior. Instead, they let the school expel me without a fight. When we got home, I expected the usual lectures and punishments, but what I got was far worse. My parents sat me down and, for the first time, they didn't hold back. They told me that I was a burden to the family, that they regretted having me, and that if they had known I would turn out to be such a disaster, they would have terminated the pregnancy. Those words cut deeper than any punishment ever could. I'd always felt like an outsider in my own family, but hearing them say it out loud made it undeniable. After that conversation, they locked me in my room for an entire week. I wasn't allowed to leave except for bathroom breaks, and my meals were brought to me on a tray like I was some kind of prisoner. I spent that week replaying their words over and over in my head, trying to make sense of how the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally could say such horrible things. I wanted to believe they didn't mean it, that they were just angry and would apologize once they'd calmed down. But deep down, I knew better. When the week was up, my parents told me to pack my things. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew better than to ask. My brother, Ryan, who was 17 at the time, helped my mom pack my bags while I sat in the car with my dad. No one said a word during the hour-long drive, but as the familiar streets of my grandmother's neighborhood came into view, I started to piece it together. I tried to convince myself that this was temporary, that they were just sending me to live with Grandma for a few weeks while they figured out how to handle me. Grandma, despite being strict, had always been kinder to me than my parents ever were. I clung to the hope that this was just another attempt to set me straight. When we arrived, my parents didn't even bother to come inside. They left my bags on the porch, told me that this would be my new home, and drove off without so much as a goodbye. As I stood there, staring at the taillights of their car disappearing down the street, I realized that this wasn't temporary. They were done with me. My grandmother opened the door and pulled me inside. She didn't say much at first. She didn't have to. The look on her face said it all. She'd agreed to take me in, but it was clear she had reservations. Over the next few hours, we sat down and talked about everything: my behavior, my parents, and what life with her would look like. She admitted that she hadn't been sure if she could take me in, especially given her age and limited resources. But after hearing about how my parents had treated me, she decided that she couldn't stand by and do nothing. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed in her guest room, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. On one hand, I was finally free of my parents' constant judgment and disdain. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was nothing more than a burden, not just to my parents, but now to my grandmother as well. I promised myself that I would change, that I would prove to her and to myself that I was worth more than the labels my parents had placed on me. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a long journey, one that would test my resilience, redefine my sense of self-worth, and ultimately shape me into the person I am today. When the day came to take Matthew to live with my mother, it felt like a somber march towards something we couldn't fully articulate. David and I had spent weeks discussing our options, and every time, the conversation ended with the same conclusion. We couldn't give Matthew what he needed anymore. Grandma Lorraine, my mother, had always been a figure of stability in my life. She was strict but fair, and she believed in the power of discipline paired with kindness. We had approached her cautiously about the possibility of Matthew living with her, explaining how overwhelmed we were and how we thought she might be able to offer him a fresh start. To our relief and perhaps guilt, she agreed, but not without hesitation. Lorraine made it clear that she loved Matthew deeply, but at her age, taking in a troubled teenager was a daunting commitment. I remember the drive to her house vividly. Matthew sat in the back seat, his headphones on and his eyes glued to the scenery passing by. He wasn't angry or defiant that day, just quiet. I wanted to say something comforting, to let him know this wasn't a punishment, but the words felt stuck in my throat. How could I explain to him that this was supposed to be for his own good when it felt like abandonment? When we arrived at Lorraine's house, she was waiting on the porch with her usual calm demeanor. Matthew stepped out of the car without a word and started unloading his things from the trunk. He didn't ask why or fight back, and that silence was somehow more heartbreaking than any outburst could have been. Lorraine greeted him with a warm hug and a reassuring smile, telling him how happy she was to have him there. She didn't make it seem like a burden, and for that, I was grateful. But I couldn't shake the guilt that we were putting this on her shoulders when it was our responsibility as his parents. After helping Matthew settle into his new room, we sat in Lorraine's kitchen for what felt like the last supper of a family that was breaking apart. Lorraine tried to keep the mood light, asking Matthew about his favorite music and whether he still liked playing video games. He answered politely, but his responses were short, and his eyes stayed on his plate. The tension in the air was suffocating. When it was time for us to leave, Matthew followed us to the door. I wanted so badly to hug him, to tell him we loved him, and that this wasn't goodbye forever. But instead, all I managed was a weak, "Take care of yourself." He nodded and watched as we drove away, standing on the porch next to Lorraine. I couldn't bring myself to look in the rearview mirror. The following weeks were a blur. The house felt emptier without Matthew, quieter. At first, it was almost a relief, a chance to breathe without the constant chaos. Ryan seemed happier, more relaxed, and David and I found ourselves arguing less. But the relief was quickly replaced by something heavier: shame. Every time I passed Matthew's empty room, I felt like a coward. I knew he wasn't in a place to fully understand why we had made this decision. And deep down, I wasn't sure I fully understood it either. We told ourselves it was for his benefit, that Lorraine's stable environment and fresh perspective would help him flourish in ways we couldn't. But part of me wondered if we had simply taken the easy way out. Lorraine called us often in the beginning, updating us on Matthew's adjustment. She was honest about the challenges, but she also spoke of small victories, how he was slowly opening up, how he had started helping her with gardening, how he seemed calmer. Each update was a bittersweet reminder that someone else was doing what we should have been doing all along. Despite Lorraine's reassurances, I couldn't bring myself to call Matthew. It wasn't that I didn't want to, I just didn't know what to say. What could I possibly tell him that wouldn't feel hollow or hypocritical? "We miss you. We're proud of you." Every time I picked up the phone, I froze. David was the same. We told ourselves we were giving him space, but the truth was, we were too ashamed to reach out. Months turned into years, and the distance between us and Matthew only grew. Lorraine stopped giving us regular updates, likely sensing that we weren't doing our part to stay connected. I tried to justify it by focusing on Ryan's needs, convincing myself that I was being a better parent to him by letting go of Matthew. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The guilt gnawed at me constantly, but instead of facing it, I buried it under excuses and distractions. Ryan thrived during those years. He excelled in school, got into a prestigious college, and seemed to have the bright future we had always dreamed of for him. I told myself that our decision had been the right one, that prioritizing Ryan had been necessary for his success. But every time I saw Lorraine at family gatherings or holidays, I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy mixed with shame. She had built a bond with Matthew that we never had, and it was clear he was better off for it. By the time Matthew was in his 20s, we were practically strangers. Lorraine had done an incredible job raising him, and he had grown into a responsible, intelligent young man. He had graduated high school with decent grades, gone to college, and started a career. All the things I thought he'd never achieve, he had done, without us. Looking back, I realized that leaving Matthew with Lorraine wasn't just about giving him a better environment. It was about giving ourselves an escape. We had been overwhelmed and scared, and instead of rising to the challenge, we ran. And while Lorraine may have saved Matthew, I knew we had failed him in ways that no amount of reasoning or justifications could ever erase. That failure stayed with me, a quiet, persistent ache that I carried every day. I tried to tell myself that Matthew had turned out fine, that he didn't need us anymore. But the truth was, I didn't know if he ever had. Years passed, and I rebuilt my life with Grandma's unwavering support. Under her roof, I thrived in ways I never imagined possible. She found tutors to help with my learning disabilities and enrolled me in a private school where teachers actually cared about my progress. For the first time in my life, I felt seen and supported. By the time I graduated high school, I had become a completely different person, confident, capable, and ready to take on the world. But while I moved forward, my parents and Ryan became distant memories. They never called, never wrote, and certainly never visited. It was as though I didn't exist. Grandma and I were fine with that arrangement. She would occasionally vent about how selfish my parents were, but she never pressured me to reach out. We had our own little world, and I was finally at peace. After I moved out for college, I stayed close to Grandma. I visited her every weekend, called her every night, and leaned on her for advice and encouragement. She was my rock, the one person who had truly believed in me when no one else did. Even when she grew older and her health began to decline, she never stopped cheering me on. Then, a few months ago, Grandma passed away. It was the hardest thing I've ever faced. Losing her felt like losing the one anchor I had in the world. But in her usual way, even in death, she had found a way to take care of me. Grandma left everything to me in her will, her home, her savings, and even a small investment account she had built up over the years. I didn't expect it, but I was deeply grateful. This was her final gift to me, a reminder of her love and belief in my potential. Not long after the funeral, the silence from my parents finally broke. I had expected some kind of contact, maybe out of obligation, maybe out of curiosity, but not for the reason they came. One afternoon, I opened my door to find my mom and dad standing there. They looked older, worn down by time, but their expressions hadn't softened. I invited them in, hopeful that maybe, just maybe, they were there to make amends. After a few awkward pleasantries and hollow condolences about Grandma, they cut straight to the point. They wanted money. Apparently, Ryan was in trouble. He'd developed a drug problem during college, and now it had spiraled out of control. They wanted me to use my inheritance to pay for his rehab, a high-end facility that they claimed was the only way to save him. For a moment, I just stared at them, trying to process what they were asking. It wasn't that I didn't feel for Ryan. I did. Addiction is no joke, and I wouldn't wish that struggle on anyone. But the sheer audacity of their request left me speechless. These were the same people who had called me a burden, a mistake, a freak. The same people who had abandoned me on Grandma's doorstep without a second thought. And now they had the nerve to ask for my help? When I found my voice, I told them I was willing to consider helping Ryan on one condition. They had to publicly acknowledge everything they had done to me and Grandma. The neglect, the cruelty, the abandonment. They needed to own up to it in front of the entire family and apologize sincerely. It wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about accountability. After all these years, I needed them to face the truth of their actions. Their reaction was immediate and predictable. My mom called me heartless, and my dad accused me of being selfish. They tried to guilt me, saying that Ryan's life was at stake and that I was punishing him for their mistakes. I calmly reminded them that I was more than willing to help, but only if they met my condition. They left in a huff, accusing me of being cold and ungrateful. Over the next few days, they bombarded me with messages, sending photos of Ryan looking gaunt and unwell, begging me to reconsider. But I held my ground. I told them that their pride had cost them everything, and now they had a choice: swallow it and admit their wrongs, or walk away empty-handed. At one point, they showed up at my door again, this time with Ryan in tow. He looked worse than I expected, thin, pale, and defeated. I felt a pang of guilt, but it wasn't enough to change my mind. I told my parents that parading Ryan in front of me wasn't going to work, and that using him as a pawn was cruel and dehumanizing. If they wanted my help, the terms hadn't changed. My dad exploded, calling me the most selfish person he'd ever met. He even dragged Grandma's name into it, accusing her of turning me against them. That was the final straw. I told them to leave and warned that if they ever tried to manipulate me again, I'd involve the police. They left, but not before hurling a few more insults my way. As the door closed behind them, I felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time, I wasn't the powerless child they had abandoned. I was in control, and they couldn't take that away from me. I didn't know what the future held for Ryan, but I knew one thing for sure. If my parents wanted my help, they would have to earn it. And if their pride was more important than their son, then so be it. After that confrontation, I thought my parents had finally gotten the message. I was wrong. A week later, they started messaging me again, this time with even more desperation. Their texts were filled with pictures of Ryan in increasingly worse conditions. Hollow eyes, trembling hands, the kind of despair that you can't fake. They kept telling me that time was running out, that without immediate help, Ryan's life might truly be at risk. It wasn't easy to ignore those messages. Ryan and I had never been close, but seeing him like that stirred something in me. Still, I knew this wasn't really about him. If my parents had cared about his well-being, they wouldn't be using him as a pawn. They were still too proud to do the one thing I'd asked, admit their mistakes. That stubbornness felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that they valued their pride more than they valued me, or even Ryan. The next escalation came 2 weeks later. I was sitting at my desk, catching up on work, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but as soon as I peeked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. They were back. Not just my parents this time, but Ryan too. He was leaning against my dad, barely able to stand on his own. For a brief moment, I considered opening the door, but then I stopped myself. Letting them in would only validate their behavior. Instead, I cracked the door just wide enough to speak. "You shouldn't have come here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My dad's face twisted in frustration. "We didn't know what else to do," he snapped. "You're just going to let your brother suffer. You're better than this." I clenched my jaw, holding back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "I already told you what I need from you," I said. "If you can't do that, then I can't help." My mom stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered. "This isn't about us. This is about Ryan. He needs you." I looked past her at Ryan. His head hung low, his breathing labored. I could tell he was ashamed to be there, dragged along like some kind of prop. It was dehumanizing, and it made me angrier at my parents than I'd ever been. They weren't here for him. They were here to save themselves from their own guilt. "I'm sorry, Ryan," I said softly, addressing him for the first time. "You don't deserve this. But this isn't the way." Before anyone could respond, I stepped back and began to close the door. My dad lunged forward, grabbing the edge. "You can't just walk away from this," he shouted. "You're no better than us if you turn your back on him." That hit a nerve, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I forced the door closed and locked it. They stayed outside for a while, pounding on the door and shouting, but eventually, they left. Once the noise stopped, I sat down on the floor, shaking with a mix of anger and sadness. For years, I had wished for some acknowledgement from my parents, some sign that they cared about me. Now, I realized that even in their desperation, they couldn't see past themselves. The next day, I made a decision. I blocked their numbers, cut off all communication, and reached out to a lawyer to make sure they couldn't contact me through any loopholes. It felt extreme, but I needed to protect my peace. My parents had burned every bridge, and I wasn't going to let them drag me down anymore. Still, the guilt lingered. I thought about Ryan often, wondering if he resented me for not stepping in. I knew it wasn't his fault, but I also knew that enabling my parents would only make things worse in the long run. If they truly wanted to help him, they would find another way. Weeks passed in silence, and I started to feel a sense of normalcy returning. Then, out of nowhere, a distant cousin reached out to me. She told me that my parents had been going around to family members, trying to paint me as the villain. They claimed that I was hoarding Grandma's money out of spite and letting my brother suffer out of revenge. The cousin assured me that most people didn't believe them, but it still stung to hear. My parents had spent years ignoring me, yet now they were willing to weaponize me when it suited their narrative. I decided to get ahead of the drama. I contacted a few close relatives and told them the truth, not just about my parents' recent behavior, but about everything. The abandonment, the neglect, the things they'd said and done. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I also didn't ask for sympathy. I just wanted the record set straight. To my relief, most of them were supportive, even outraged on my behalf. Some even apologized for not stepping in sooner. As for my parents, their attempts to shame me eventually fizzled out. Without direct access to me, they lost their leverage. I heard through the grapevine that Ryan had finally entered a rehab program. Though it wasn't the luxury facility they'd originally wanted, I hoped for his sake that it would be enough. Despite everything, I still think about Ryan. I hope he makes it through, and maybe one day we can rebuild some kind of relationship. But as for my parents, I'm done. They made their choices long ago, and now they're living with the consequences. I've spent my whole life trying to earn their love, only to realize that it was never really about me. And that's okay, because for the first time, I'm free. Free to live my life on my own terms, without their shadow hanging over me. It's been months since my parents' last visit, and in that time, I've taken steps to distance myself from them completely. After our final argument, where my father called me selfish and accused both me and my grandmother of being cold-hearted, I realized there was nothing left to salvage. For years, I had hoped, maybe even unconsciously, that they might someday acknowledge what they'd done to me. But their pride was an unyielding wall, even in the face of their own son's suffering. After they left that day, I sat in my apartment, staring at the door, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, disappointment, they all blurred together into a single, overwhelming feeling of exhaustion. I realized I couldn't keep letting them drag me back into their chaos. They had made their choices long ago, and I had to make mine. The first thing I did was change my phone number. It felt dramatic at first, but I knew it was necessary. I couldn't handle their barrage of calls and messages anymore. Every time I saw their names pop up on my screen, it sent me spiraling into anger and frustration, and I didn't want to live like that. I also moved to a new apartment in a quieter neighborhood, far from the place they had last visited. I didn't tell anyone except a few trusted friends and relatives, and I made it clear to those I confided in that my address was not to be shared. Blocking them out felt like tearing off a bandage. It stung, but there was a strange sense of relief, too. For the first time in my life, I felt free of their judgment and expectations. I could live my life without the shadow of their disappointment looming over me. In the weeks that followed, I started focusing on the things that mattered to me. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and challenges. My coworkers noticed a shift in my demeanor, and one of them even commented that I seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. They weren't wrong. Without my parents' presence, I could finally breathe. I also began reflecting on everything my grandmother had taught me. Her resilience, her kindness, her belief in second chances, all of it stayed with me, shaping the person I was becoming. I realized that the best way to honor her memory was to live a life she would be proud of. She had always told me I was stronger than I believed, and now, for the first time, I felt it too. As for my brother, I wish I could say things ended differently, but the truth is, I don't know how he's doing. After that day when they brought him to my apartment, I felt nothing but pity for him. It wasn't his fault that our parents had placed him on a pedestal while casting me aside. He didn't ask to be their golden child any more than I asked to be the scapegoat. But at the same time, I couldn't help him. Not under those conditions. I often wonder if my brother ever thinks about me, if he's ever questioned why things turned out the way they did. Part of me hopes that, once he's in a better place, he'll reach out on his own terms, not because our parents forced him to. But until then, I've made peace with the idea that some things are beyond my control. The fallout with my parents hasn't been easy, and there are days when the guilt creeps in, whispering that I should have done more, been more forgiving, tried harder. But then I remind myself of everything they put me through, the years of neglect, the cruel words, the way they discarded me like an afterthought. All of it built a wall between us that neither of us seemed willing to tear down. I don't think they'll ever truly understand the impact of their actions. For them, I was always the problem child, the one who didn't fit their mold, and maybe that's the narrative they'll cling to for the rest of their lives. But I refuse to let their version of me define who I am. I am not the burden they made me believe I was. I am not a mistake or a disappointment. I am someone who overcame, someone who thrived despite the odds. These days, I focus on the life I've built for myself. I have a stable job, good friends, and the memory of a grandmother who loved me unconditionally. That's more than enough for me. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in years, I feel like it's mine to shape. As for my parents, I don't hate them. I don't think I ever truly did. I'm angry, yes, and hurt, but deep down, I feel sorry for them. They missed out on knowing the person I've become, and that's their loss. Maybe one day they'll realize that, but even if they don't, I'll be okay, because I have something they never gave me: peace.